Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event today, which is the Neuroscience of Trauma and Chronic Stress. This is a virtual event which has been put together in collaboration with the Dana Foundation. This week is a very exciting week for all of us. It is Brain Awareness Week, which is a global campaign founded by the Dana Foundation to really promote the excitement and the wonderment that the brain and brain research and the impact that brain research has on our personal lives. We are really excited to be part of this campaign, and we encourage you to go to the Dana Foundation website on dana.org to learn more about Brain Awareness Week, to learn more about the brain and all the cool discoveries coming out of labs around the world. My name is Sloka Iyengar. I will be moderating this amazing panel today. I am a neuroscientist and an educator, and I work as a public health consultant with several organizations in India and around the world. I am deeply interested in the convergence of neuroscience and mental health, and I'm really excited to present today's session to all of you today. Thank you so much for joining. The way this next hour is going to look like is I will introduce our amazing speakers, Mike and Vivian, and then I'll ask them a few questions about their work and about recent findings from the field. Of course, I would love to introduce the organization Beyond Conflict, and our speakers today, both Mike and Vivian, are part of the fantastic team at Beyond Conflict. Beyond Conflict is a global nonprofit organization, and its mission is to address the root causes and consequences of conflict. The organization combines insights from brain and behavior science and has 30 years of experience in conflict resolution, advancing new strategies to prevent violence and to promote peace, both at home and abroad. Our amazing panelists today, Vivian Khedari DePierro is the research director and chief psychologist at Beyond Conflict. She's a psychologist, and her clinical and research work has focused on the understanding and treatment of psychological trauma, particularly among at-risk youth, forcibly displaced individuals, as well as immigrants. Our second panelist is Mike Niconchuk. He is the program director for trauma and violent conflict at Beyond Conflict, as well as a senior technical expert for mental health and psychosocial support at QuestScope. Mike's work focuses on neuroscience, trauma, and intergroup violence. Welcome both Mike and Vivian to this amazing panel. It's so nice to see you both. We would love to start off talking about your personal experiences. What have been your experiences that have led you to your current work now? Vivian, would you like to share with us how you got to this work?
Yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm Vivian Khedari, like was mentioned. I am a clinical psychologist. I first trained as a clinical psychologist in Caracas in Venezuela. It was, while I was growing up in Venezuela, it was the political climate, well, it continues to be quite complicated, and Caracas was quite violent as a city. And I was interested in psychology and also interested in what was unique about how we saw psychology in contexts where stress was ongoing, where people were sensing and accurately that there was a lot of danger in the environment around them. And then I came to the United States to continue my studies and did my PhD in clinical psychology, focusing on trauma and psychophysiology, and joined Beyond Conflict, where I've been working with Mike. So just to keep that brief, that's kind of the story, I guess. I think research is research, so I am interested in populations that are forcibly displaced. I'm half Syrian, half Venezuelan, and those are two of the big groups of forcibly displaced folks around the world. And so I was just interested in what about psychology applies when we're working with folks that are going through situations that are not the norm in which we have done the research about psychology.
Thank you, Vivian. How about you, Mike? What experiences led to your work today?
Well, thank you, Sloka. And first and foremost, having a brain like so many of us on this call led me here, fascinated by my own self, my own journey, the lived experiences of myself and my family, First and foremost, I thought I was coming into adulthood to study politics and international relations and security issues. And then my world was kind of turned upside down when I was 19 and working in Guatemala. My mom is from Guatemala, and her family had some experiences during the armed conflict there, which left an indelible imprint on the dynamics of my own upbringing, of my family, of how they thought about themselves, about national identity, about conflict, politics, all of it. And so I knew from the time that I was 19 that, yeah, I was interested in politics, but really in the politics of the mind and how our brains and minds contribute to who we are as political people, as political actors in the world, and how it affects intergroup relations, how it affects generations, how we raise our kids, how we talk to our grandkids, how we operate with those in our community. So I, over time, as I got to work more and more on issues of human psychology, of mental health and psychosocial support, of working with displaced and marginalized youth, first in Guatemala and then here in Jordan, in Amman, in the Syrian refugee crisis, I knew and was convinced that what I was really interested in is understanding how we make decisions as a result of and potentially towards future traumas. There's no question that violence and trauma and displacement affect us to our core. And those can contribute to subsequent decision makings in communities, in our personal lives that affect so many aspects of who we are. And so I changed courses and went to get a master's degree in social cognition from University College London. And since then I've been focused specifically on this intersection of trauma and intergroup conflict and how those two things play off of each other, how trauma can be both a cause and consequence of violence, and how we promote strategies for well-being, for self-care, for trauma recovery in and outside of professional care systems.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I think thank you for sharing your journeys. The excitement around Brain Awareness Week, for me at least as a neuroscientist, is taking something as big and as abstract even as trauma and conflict and chronic stress, and even trying to understand, which I also always think is a privilege to be able to understand even a little bit about how the brain works and how experiences around us affect the brain and change the brain. So that brings us to chronic stress and trauma. Vivian, would you like to share a little bit about what is chronic stress and what is trauma?
Sure. So when we think about stress, we just think about demand on our systems, on our physiology. So for example, if I was going to get on my exercise bike and I would start pedaling really fast, that is a stressor on my body. That is a good type of stress. And it makes my body react in ways that help it deal with that situation. It will, my heart will go faster. I will pump more oxygen to my extremities so I can pedal real fast. So I'm responding to stress. Sometimes stress is something negative. It's not something that is exercise. It could be that we have a major problem or a major conflict in a relationship, and that also is making us our body kind of like prime itself to react and to respond to like the excessive demand. What happens with chronic stress is that sometimes we are in contexts where this stress response that our body begins to sort of help us deal with the new input from the environment, to help us respond to it adequately and invest more energy in that targeted thing that we need to deal with to reestablish some balance. Sometimes even when we're doing that, because there are multiple sources of stress, or because the stressor is just not something that is fully under our control to change the outcome of, then our body kind of starts these responses of, like, again, priming us for reacting quickly, priming us for having like more of a fight flight type of activity, where again, like heart rate is fast, where our breathing is also, and our thinking and everything is targeted onto the specific task at hand. All of these things never get to quite get into a feedback loop where we say, okay, there was a stressor, we dealt with it, and now my body can recover, my body can resume a state of relaxation, my body can begin to calm down and down regulate, so that we return to that baseline level of balance. When we're in environments where we don't get the opportunity to do that, then we start to see people become exhausted, because our bodies are not made to sustain that high level of stress constantly. It's supposed to be something that is situation specific, that we engage in the response, it is helpful in the short term, and then we reestablish balance. When we speak about trauma, it's a little bit different. So chronic stress, again, we're talking about something pervasive, we cannot change it, it's kind of always there. Trauma is something acute, out of the blue, it happens. So we are kind of going through our lives and with this following a set of rules based on our expectations. I expect that if I get on my car and I wear my seatbelt and I use my mirrors, that I'm gonna be relatively safe. And so if one day, while I'm doing these things that I have learned keep me safe, all of a sudden something happens that kind of challenges that confidence that I had. So one day I get into a bad car crash, then I'm kind of in this place from just for the sake of seeking to protect myself. I'm kind of questioning, what about my expectations? Where was the failure? Where did I not see this situation coming? And so that can be a little bit paralyzing, because trauma, in a way, in these situations that kind of overwhelm us and make us feel so threatened out of the blue, make us start to think, why did I not see this coming? Why did I not prepare a stress response to kind of like be ready to handle it as it came? Like, how did I miss this? And that makes us kind of like lose a lot of confidence and start to kind of question and constantly be looking for signs that might indicate that a similar danger is gonna be coming. Now, similarly to how initially the stress response in some situations is quite positive and helps us adapt to the environment, or responses to that type of event, to those events that paralyze us and overwhelm us and that we consider traumatic, our initial responses to them are also very adaptive and very protective. So when we try to avoid the things that we associated with the trauma, or when we try, or we're constantly looking again for signs of threats that might indicate that a repetition of the trauma might happen, or when we are kind of always like tense and kind of like there's a little sound and I jump, like all of these things are things that I'm engaging in to protect myself. But if we don't get the opportunity to, again, give ourselves the feedback that safety has been reestablished, that we can be in a world and do A and B and assume that if I am in the car, that 50 times I'm in the car, maybe one time there was a car crash, but most of the times these things work and keep me relatively safe, and I can decrease that stress response and reestablish some more normal functioning, normal heart rate, normal level of tension. If we deprive ourselves of those opportunities, then these trauma responses are maintained, and that's when we start to talk about things like PTSD. And if there's too many traumas, the same way that I said there could be too many stressors, and that's bad. When there's too many traumas, it's much harder for us to kind of reestablish that safety, and for us to once again maintain that level of, I'm going to be super alert to all of the threats. If my life is filled with too many traumas, there's not a lot of productivity investing my energy in scanning for these threats. Everything feels threatening, and therefore I'm not constantly trying to protect or anticipate the threat. And when we see these types of presentations, it's as if we move away from the fight or flight and enter the realm of the freezing responses. And that's when we talk about more complex PTSD type of responses to trauma. So again, stress, something good or bad. When bad and maintained, takes a toll on the body. Trauma, something out of the blue that overwhelmed us. Initial response to trauma, very adaptive, very protective. When we maintain it over time, it is not letting us engage with the world as we did before and taking a toll on the body, but by maintaining that high stress response, high arousal response, or in the case of where everything is threatening, by not even starting the high arousal protective response and then leaving us vulnerable to more danger.
Thank you, Vivian. I love that you gave examples and the clarity between chronic stress and trauma with real life examples. Again, thank you so much for that. Coming to how chronic stress and trauma affect the brain, Mike, would you like to share a little bit about the brain and the nervous system, and what are some of the key structures and processes in the brain and nervous system that come into play when we talk about chronic stress and trauma that Vivian described?
Yeah, thank you, Sloka. So the first thing that I want everyone to do is to imagine what they think the world was like 40,000 years ago. 40,000 years ago, before any of the buildings that we're sitting in were there. If some of you are sitting outside, maybe you have an easier time at this little task. But imagine the world 40,000 years ago. The forensic anthropological data that we have on humans, on Homo sapiens, indicates that more or less, not a perfect match, but more or less, the brains that we have in their physical anatomy, their function, structure, the brains that we have today, Homo sapiens of today, haven't changed that much in around that period of time. But when we think of how dramatically society has changed in that time, there's something going on here. So the structure and functions of our brains are more or less the same over this massive time scale. Yet what those brains are having to have us navigate is vastly different 40,000 years ago from today, with the exception of a couple of things. So when we ask people, what do you think the number one task of your brain is? Usually we get different responses of helping me navigate the world, of thinking, of feeling. All of those are partial truths. But the reality is the number one task of your brain is to help you stay alive and successfully navigate the world around you. To a certain extent, and whether we like it or not, your brain doesn't necessarily care about all of the facets of your social and emotional well-being, because those are secondary to this fundamental priority of staying alive and successfulully navigating your environment. And your brain is, of course, a part of your physical body. We often have, because of sort of this Cartesian, I think before I am approach, we separate the mind and brain from the rest of the body, but really it is deeply integrated, receiving constant feedback from and signaling to the rest of the body through instructions from neurochemical signatures, markers, and also through the central nervous system. This thing in your head is connected down by the neck to the rest of your body through your autonomic nervous system. And the communication within the brain itself helps coordinate a host of different bodily functions, some of which we're aware of, and most of which we're not. So inside your brain, which is mostly fat and water, there's about 86 billion cells called neurons. And those neurons are constantly communicating with each other from the tails of one to the head of the other, communicating signals in the form of electricity and chemical impulses. And these impulses go through these pathways that then influence or initiate certain behaviors or send certain instructions to other parts of the brain or to the body. So the brain is structured in a way where there's this massive and intricate internal communication that creates all sorts of things, everything from thoughts to emotions to moving my hands this way back and forth. And it does this in service of one primary thing, keeping you alive. So if we can understand that the brain's priority is to keep you alive, we can understand a lot about what goes on in the context of chronic stress and trauma. So these 86 billion neurons are connected to each other in more than 160 trillion different possible connections. And when we experience threat or when we experience stress of any kind, whether good or bad, positive or negative, the brain is sending certain signals to the rest of the body to prepare us to confront this threat. You're trying to stay alive, so it's going to coordinate with the rest of the body to help you either confront the stress in some way, whether that's in the form of running towards it and fighting it, laying passively, submitting to it, or running the other direction. So there's different degrees of active and passive responses, all of which are coordinated by the brain, coordinated by the brain and the rest of the body, of course. Some of the key structures that are relevant for understanding how we respond to both chronic stress and to these overwhelming instances that are trauma-inducing or potentially traumatic for us is, first of all, from what we would call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And in 30 seconds, basically this is to say that there's inside your brain, there's the equivalent of an engineer sitting at the control tower of an airport who is observing for possible risks and threats among many other functions that he has. But when there's something that's salient or relevant or potentially threatening, it initiates a preparatory process to confront that, sending signals from the amygdala to the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and then down with a whole host of hormonal interlocutors in that process to the kidneys, and something above the kidneys called the adrenal cortex, which produces a host of hormones, including norepinephrine and cortisol, which are the ones we most often hear about in the context of stress. And those hormones are sort of messengers to other functions of the body, everything from your immune system to giving inflammatory and inflammation markers, to changing digestion, to changing blood flow, to altering other intra-brain signals. And so these hormones have different functions that more or less try to consolidate tasks of the body to confront that acute stress and stay alive. However, some of these hormonal processes that we see and an overaction, sort of what we would call hyperactivity of these hormonal responses can have negative effects in the long term, including weakening the immune system, weakening the ability of the heart to pump blood normally through the body, changing how we breathe, making our breath shallower and faster, which can promote hyperventilation, changing our sleep patterns because we're constantly on edge and not feeling safe. And if we can't sleep, we can't breathe. If we can't breathe, we can't sleep. And then we can't consolidate memories. We can't dream. There's a whole host of things that happen there. On the other hand, we have another system that's important to mention, the autonomic nervous system, which is another way that the brain signals to the body to help us confront danger. And however, when we confront these dangers in the form of traumatic experiences, sometimes the signals that happen and the processes that we have get sort of embedded or stuck in us some way in the form of flashbacks, of re-experiencing, of having what we would call triggers. Sort of physiological, certain environmental triggers can help us create in us the same reactions we may have had to a stressful event into the future after it's passed. And the autonomic nervous system, we can equate it to the gas and brakes of a car. It's divided into two sides, not physical sides, but two opposing yet complementary functions using the same nerves that are connected to organs throughout your body, from your head literally to your toes. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. If we go to Greek, sympathetic meaning friendly, parasympathetic, the opposite of that, unfriendly. So the sympathetic nervous system, why we call it friendly, is because it's approach-oriented. It helps speeds things up in the body, widening our pupils, changing our salivary ducts to produce less saliva actually, to change the blood flow to our digestive tract, to increase the speed of our breathing, and then lastly, to promote the down inflammation of muscles, to prevent inflammation so that we can run and confront stress accordingly. So this is what speeds things up throughout the body to help us confront stress. That is great if we're exercising, if we're running from a lion that's chasing us, or if we're trying to escape from airstrikes that are attacking our houses. Those are incredibly adaptive functions that are relatively automatically regulated by the responses of our brain, or by the calculations, those automatic calculations of our brain when assessing threats. On the other hand, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which has a lot of, we could say, the phrase is rest and digesting functions. It's certain different opposing signals to the sympathetic nervous system that, for example, increases saliva production, contracts the pupils, slows our breathing, increases blood flow to our digestive tract, and helps us generally feel slightly calmer. This is achieved partially through a main nerve called the vagus nerve. So these parallel systems help us confront stress, gear up, and calm down. But these things get a little bit haywire in the context of trauma and can sort of create long-term reactions, either where we're incredibly reactive or not reactive at all. And these are because of what the brain has communicated to the body, and the body has sort of ingrained these memories and remembered them in certain ways that help promote either two extreme reactions to trauma, after trauma, either excitatory or highly inhibitory signals that help us feel not who we were before after we go through these things.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciated bringing in the physiology, the things that we experience in our lives and kind of aligning that with what might be happening in the brain and the nervous system. So thanks for that amazing, amazing overview. The next question that we would love to know about a little bit is about your current work. At Beyond Conflict, how do you use all this knowledge to address chronic stress and trauma? Vivian, would you like to share, please?
Sure, I think both Mike and I can share in this one. There's many ways in which we do it, but like one of the main ways is through an intervention that we have named the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, where we basically, what we do is we try to teach people again about the neuroscience and the psychophysiology that explains to them their trauma and their stress responses. Oftentimes people face the way that they're behaving after having been through trauma or during moments of chronic stress, and they feel this sense of like, why am I even behaving this way? This, like, they are adding to their stressors by judging themselves very critically and judging their responses very critically, because they might not necessarily align with who they imagine they would be in a moment of stress or in a moment of after a trauma. And so by teaching people about how our brain works, how everything that Mike was saying about how it's always intended to protect us, and how all of the systems are a part of us and part of the way we think and a part of the way we approach the world, and then understanding them helps us then see why we react in these unfamiliar ways sometimes, and also what we can do to take control of our bodies in some instances, and kind of like regain control a little bit by teaching people in settings that have been affected by conflict, kind of like in refugee camps in Jordan for Syrian refugees. We're able to, in a way, decrease people's negative thoughts about themselves in the aftermath of a war and conflict, so decrease mental health related stigma, and kind of create a little bit of a sense of agency in that they can do certain activities to help their bodies find, in the face of stress that is ongoing, those moments of having respite, and understanding how on the short term there might not be a lot that we can do to change the very valid stressors that are causing very valid distress. That the idea of mental health in those settings is not be happy and be oblivious to the stressors around you. There is, in the face of injustice, it is normal and natural for us to be stressed and for us to be upset and angry. But it's about, if this is the reality that we have now for the foreseeable future, how is knowing that it's not a sprint, a short stressor that we will handle, but a marathon. What can we do to help your body resist and have spaces of refueling, so that you're more able to deal with the day-to-day things that you have to deal with, so that you can get through the situation. So by teaching people about this, we hope to empower them more to engage in types of activities that encourage self-care, even in the face of very, very valid responses to stress. Mike, you can add more to there.
I guess on a slightly more narrative note, I've spent the past 10 years working with people that have had to flee war of different kinds, shapes, and forms. Before that, I was working with folks who dealt with war 20 years, 30 years prior. Very few people that I've ever met, if any, chose to live through what they went through. Very few sought those situations out. It was a product of circumstance, of things beyond their control. Time and time again, you hear in Arabic, they say, "Ma اخترنا هالطريق." We didn't choose this path, right? No one chooses to live through stress or trauma, to live through chronic stress or trauma willingly. No one seeks it out. And at the same time, if we're going to live in a world where people are forced to live through stresses and traumas, I think it's part of someone's fundamental human rights to have access to information about how it might affect them, because this is fundamentally about agency. And whether we're working with war-affected refugees, working with post-prison populations, working with folks who might be entering conflict in the near future, it's someone's right to know, what will this injustice, this conflict, this disaster potentially take away from me, from my agentic sense of self? How might it change, and how has it changed who I thought I was before and who I feel like now, about who I might want to be? And how can I gain a little bit more control over how I respond, not only to what has happened to me, but what is still happening in the here and now? Because while we want to believe that trauma is a one-time, two-time event, and there are many cases where it is, and it can still have tremendous negative consequences, when we think about forced displacement conflict, we have to think about long-term exposure to multiple traumas and to chronic stress. I remember being in Berlin about 4 years ago, and this Palestinian man who has been in Berlin for more than 50 years, and someone called on him to share some perspective in an art gallery as a refugee. And he said, "Flüchtlinge, refugee? I thought I stopped being a refugee when I became a citizen." So these narratives of conflict that we carry within ourselves continue to shape our identity and how others perceive and interact with us for 30, 40, 50 years. So by bringing folks a sense of, first of all, what might be happening inside of you? And second of all, therefore, what is your responsibility and ability to deal with those things in a way that feels empowering, in a way that feels agentic, in a way that feels life-giving, when very little things in the world are life-giving at the moment, potentially. So it's about trying to infuse agency and knowledge in people's lives to help them take those concrete steps forward to live the lives that they should and want to.
Thank you, Mike. Again, I think the sense of empowerment, even in pretty dismal conditions, I think that is so clear, and really the impact of your work. For all our participants in the chat, you will find a link to the field guide for barefoot psychology, as well as an impact report for this guide. So please take a look if you're interested. We would love to, hear more from you if you have any thoughts after today's presentation. This brings us to, again, thinking of, what can we do in real time in a situation that might be, as has been mentioned, unfortunate and dismal. Vivian will very kindly share some self-care exercises that all of our participants can do in real time. Please take it away, Vivian.
Thank you. And I saw there's also very interesting questions coming through, and so mindful that we want to also leave time for questions. But I'm only going to demonstrate one exercise, and I just wanted to give a brief introduction, because we got together here to talk about the neuroscience of stress and trauma, and this very narrow and very biological lens to it, and that can give the impression then that the self-care strategies are something so elaborate and so fancy and scientific, and that's kind of what we're kind of trying to the viewpoint that we are trying to defeat through interventions like the field guide. Everything we do in every moment is neuro. It's our brain is doing it. It's all of it is neuroscience. So it can be like me watching the little video of the cat because I find little cute cats relaxing, and then I watched it for a while. All of that is having an impact on me, and it's and so a lot of self-care really is just understanding that a lot of things that we do that we tend to sometimes can be very critical about, oh, this is a waste of time. Why am I doing this instead of working? Why am I doing this instead of doing this other productive thing? That actually making time for rest and making time to indulge in things that we find pleasant is a productive thing to do, because it refuels us and we need it. And it's creating those parentheses that give us some respite even in the face of chronic stressors. Other things that we can do is that by understanding how the systems that on our body get impacted by stress, we can also take control of this system. So it's a very telling way when we're, for example, having, I don't know, perhaps symptoms similar to what a panic attack would look like. And so we see that our breathing is going very, very fast. All of a sudden, the thing that we might notice the most, the thing that might be most salient to us in that moment is our breathing. And that system that is affected and impacted by the stress is also the system through which we can in turn impact our bodies to regain control. So by taking control of our breathing and doing paced breathing techniques in moments like that, we are taking that system that was kind of going haywire and saying no, I am a more rational part of me, and a less instinctive part of me is also assessing the risks on the situation. And I think that this is a moment in which we can try and calm down. And so I'm going to take control of this system, and I'm going to give feedback to my body that things are safe right now, and I don't need that defensive response right now. So that's kind of how we play into incorporating the neuro lens to self-care strategies. And so one that we can do right now, which is very easy to do over Zoom, is to it's an exercise that we call progressive. We call arm squeezes, and basically what it helps with to modulate our nervous or sympathetic nervous system's response. So when we're in front of stress, like Mike said, our sympathetic nervous system, that the one that approaches, the one that is the gas pedal, is kind of the most active one, and it is accelerating all of the systems that are involved in our fight and flight responses. We know that we can modulate that through the activity of a nerve called the vagus nerve, and a way in which we can do that is through pressure points. By applying pressure on our body, we kind of stimulate the activity on that nerve, and in turn that stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, the one that rests. So something as basic as simply like taking our arms and squeezing them gently without causing pain, in a level of pressure that is firm, but not painful and not generating stress, we are able to then activate that part of our body and help our body to relax. So now I'm going to simply just walk us through a little bit of how that might look like. And so knowing that explanation, knowing that what we're about to do can impact our body, that we have the skills in our body and the tools in our body to kind of regulate ourselves. We have been doing it for much longer than psychology has even existed. With that in our minds, we can all find a comfortable position in wherever we're sitting, wherever you're watching us from. Sit so that your back is firmly behind your chair, if you're in a chair, or in another position that allows you to feel grounded. And just take a moment to take a deep breath with me. Just inhale, exhale, and we're gonna just do it one more time. Inhale, exhale, and now gently we're gonna press one of our arms across our chest to our shoulder and the other arm, as if we were giving ourselves a hug. And from our shoulders, we're gonna give ourselves a gentle but firm squeeze. We're gonna squeeze and release. And that's not supposed to happen, so that we can be relaxed. So let's refocus now. We're gonna squeeze and release. And now gently, we're gonna move our hands down just under where our hands were before. So I was here, I'm going here, moving gently down, lower on my arm, and I'm once again gonna squeeze firmly and release. I like to take a deep breath in as I'm squeezing. I'm moving further down, so I'm gonna squeeze and take a deep breath in. And release, and as I release, I exhale. And I move further down on my shoulders, on my elbows now, so I squeeze, deep breath in, and release. And I'll move further down your arms by squeezing and releasing in a pace that feels natural to you, comfortable to you, while also breathing. I have now reached my wrists. I'm also once again squeezing, releasing, and I'm gonna start making my way back up. So now I'm going up on my arms again, doing this gentle squeeze. Take a deep breath and release. Squeeze and release. And that's it with the demonstration. So as you see, for some of you, maybe I can't quite see you in the type of presentation that we have, but usually we like to, when we do these types of exercise, ask, because what we see is that we are all so unique. So some people might have found this very soothing, and they may feel like, oh yes, I am way more relaxed now that I did this. And other folks maybe not. Other folks may be feeling like, wait, that actually, like when I was doing that, I actually realized that I have this shoulder pain that I wasn't really fully aware of. And now I'm so aware that my shoulder hurt. And now I'm perhaps even more stressed or more concerned or more distracted. And that's kind of part of what we see when we take these moments to kind of get attuned into our bodies or sensations, right? So for those of you who it felt positive, who found some room there to relax, then yeah, that's what's happening. So you're helping your body create a little bit of a slowdown with the pressure points. You're stimulating the modulations that allows your parasympathetic nervous system to regain. And it's a very discrete exercise that we can do anywhere. We can do it in line to pay for something in the bank. We can do it in any moment that feels right for us, and we can quickly just try to just like giving ourselves like a nice little hug. And for those of you that it might not have felt that way, for those of you who are like, oh, I hated it, this did nothing for me, then that's also an opportunity to kind of practice that little bit of self-compassion that comes from understanding how our brains work, how our nervous system works, how we are all kind of, again, reacting to different stimulus, and that we are not all following the same playbook. And so it's not, there's nothing strange about us if the relaxation technique that worked for somebody doesn't work for us. That just means that that's why we have a big menu of potential relaxation techniques. Maybe I'm more focused on breathing techniques and I don't want to do pressure points because it does remind me of a pain that I have. Or maybe for me, it needs more movement and I want to do stretching. There's a lot of things that we can do, again, to create those parentheses. And I think we're going to share a link to another example of an exercise in the chat, I think. And that's what I have there. Mike, did you want to add something about the one that we're sharing, or you can...
I'll just note that the link that will be shared in the chat is an example of how we leave some of the content with the folks in our program through audiovisual tools. Sometimes because of various circumstances and logistical constraints, it's not always the easiest to learn and exercise in front of people if you're going through some of this in a group. So we try to provide anyone that attends our community-based programs with audiovisual tools on their phone and on an online portal to be able to access the content whenever they want. So we're going to leave you with an example of a video for an exercise called alternate nostril breathing, which is a deep breathing exercise that actually plays into the inhalations and exhalations through different sides of the nose, through the nostrils. And it's modeled for us by two of our fantastic refugee women facilitators here in Jordan.
Thank you so much, Mike and Vivian. So amazing. Thanks for facilitating that exercise too, Vivian. Very, very gladly, we do have time for some questions, and we have amazing questions from our audience. The first one is, talking about intergenerational trauma. Can you speak to the effects of trauma as it is reinforced through multi-generational experiences of stress or threats?
Yes. So there's something I always like to tell people when we think about intergenerational trauma. I know it's a concept that's becoming very, in a way, trendy. We're speaking about it a lot more recently. And I like to remind people that, when we think about evolution and how it works and how our species, every species is kind of priming the next generation to be more able to survive whatever stress, I'm sorry about my dog, whatever stressors they have faced, then like what is intuitive, what is logical is for us to consider. Stop it. Sorry. Mike, can you take over while my dog, you know what I'm going to say?
Yes. Vivian will deal with Mambro and we will continue. So there's different ways to conceive of intergenerational trauma, of course, and it's really about seeing evolution in real time. We wouldn't be surprised when we see, for example, an animal that is increasingly living in colder climates, or the climate's becoming colder, or the animal is migrating more and more to colder climates. We'll see subsequent generations develop a thicker coat of fur to acclimatize, to deal with, to cope with the environment that they are now in. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, one of the things that we see, for example, is epigenetic transfer of certain hormone levels, or that the children or grandchildren of, let's take Rachel Yehuda's research as an example of Holocaust survivors, may have lower baseline levels or altered baseline levels of certain hormones that might predispose them for certain mental health conditions like depression and or anxiety. But that's not really the full story. All we're seeing is that we're seeing evolution in action, transmitted across generations, not just in the physiological or genetic sense, but also in how family systems are maintained, how parents raise their children in ways that seem protective in order to cope with or deal with the trauma that might have happened in the past. So whether it's encoded through learned behavior within families or in genes, we can see it reinforced across generations in multiple ways. And this is where we see, for example, cycles of re-victimization, not because the trauma has somehow been transferred, but because of damages to relationships, ways of behaving, ways of relating, the way that entire communities function. We see certain environments become quite incubative or incubating cycles of violence, not because there's something inherently intergenerational happening, because through learned behavior and through person-environment interactions, there's certain behaviors that might be sustained or more likely.
Yeah, and now that my dog is quite old, that like the reason why we like to kind of like emphasize this role of like what is adaptive about it is that I think that Arisa we sometimes state when we're talking so much about the neurological impact of trauma and like the genetic impact of trauma is that we might give people the impression that like they're permanently flawed, permanently scarred by these things that happen, by these things that they inherited. And particularly with the intergenerational part, it's more like your grandparents, your great-grandparents, they were incredibly badass. They survived, like they were greedy enough to survive this huge stressor and to somehow encode that and pass it on so that you would have better chances. They were not transmitting a vulnerability. They were trying to make you more resilient to what you were gonna face. So you're not at a disadvantage. You were given in a way almost an advantage when these things do get passed down. And that is true about also like any type of trauma adaptation. It's temporary. Our brain continues to create new neurological connections. We are not permanently scarred.
Thank you, Vivian. And this is an amazing segue to another question we have, which is, what are some protective factors that you believe are most reliable at protecting us against effects of trauma and chronic stress? So some protective factors.
Well, there are many. The main one I think has to do with our relationships. Our relationships are the people around us, the people that we go to for support are the first people who might notice when we are not ourselves, when we're not quite handling things the way we normally handle. And then that moment of feedback, there's a lot of opportunity, to correct paths, to get a little bit of support. And so that is incredibly, in terms of like resources that help us survive, relationships is one of the big ones up there. And also just like, again, I think anybody you ask this question to might highlight different ones that's going from their own personal experience and their own personal biases. But I think even just having that ability to like trying to recognize what are the strengths that have led us to survive whatever we have survived, and that we are not just holding symptoms or vulnerabilities, that the fact that we're like present at any given moment means that we have those resources and that we have the curiosity to wonder about ourselves. What are the positives that are getting us through day to day, and what is valuable about the things that we're doing to get us through day to day? I think that's also helpful in creating a narrative that encourages self-compassion and encourages us to like be in a path of recovery rather in a path of like self-stigmatization.
Thank you. And an additional question we have is if you could share examples of positive workplace communication techniques or communication techniques in general for people that might have experienced trauma.
Maggie, you want to go?
I'll let the clinician handle this one.
I think that question is it's a difficult to answer question because statistically people who have experienced trauma is a very, very big bucket that in a given moment might include all of us in different thresholds, in different levels of how acute it might be. So, but if we're talking about specifically people who are in the present moment, perhaps dealing with the experience of not feeling quite themselves, quite in control, feeling that they are currently being impacted and affected, and that their performance in work is currently not what they wish it would be because of the things that they're coping with. I think it's also a little bit of a personal decision where we have to be protective, right? Some of us have the privilege to be working in systems where there is room to share information, to disclose ourselves safely enough when we believe that disclosure will lead to increased support. And some of us do not have that luxury, and then kind of have to keep that kind of like are in that challenging space of like, how do I get through all of these responsibilities while maintaining this like facade and I'm like just fine, when most of us are never just fine. Like we're all carrying a lot of baggage. So I think it's like there isn't a one size fits all response for a question like that. I think it's important to have the question, to invite the question to the workspace, and to think about how do we bring that human part of us that is not always going to be like at their very best into the workspace, and what room is there in my workspace to create acceptance for something like that. That's the starting point, but the tone and the specific conversations are going to be very, very specific to context.
I would just add, as someone who has, without any formal clinical training, interacted for the past 10 years with many, many trauma affected folks and folks with diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder and other conditions, that the biggest lesson that I've learned around communicating with folks is to trust them to know what makes them feel safe. There's so many instincts that we have to want to protect and shelter, and thinking of how we're being accommodating to certain folks that have gone through incredibly hard to imagine or impossible conditions. But the reality is everyone's the expert in their own body. And my best friend, for example, is a trauma survivor. And I always have to defer to him to know what he needs in that moment, because it's his body, his safety. He knows how to construct it, even if it means that I don't have a role, or that it needs to be silent and no contact. It's on their terms. It's on the other person's terms to know what they need in that moment to make them feel safe. And respecting that, even our good intentions just aren't enough, and they will never be.
Thank you, Mike. I think that's, again, amazing examples, like real life examples. The other question we have had is on this, unresolved trauma can often, or does often, fuel further violence and can give rise to this us versus them mentality. With so many people around the world experiencing trauma, what do we do to, address that trauma, work to break the cycle of violence and revenge and the rise of violent extremism? Again, I'm sure it's not a short answer, but how can we start thinking about this?
I'll start with that. So as I said before, your brain's trying to keep you alive. And in that, it can lead to a whole lot of negative consequences and unwanted outcomes. And it's not to say that we have no control over it, actually quite the opposite. We always have a decision in committing harmful behavior to others. And almost all cases that I can think of, there's a decision. And we have to be really careful at the collective level and the individual level, how certain survival instincts might be actually promoting us or encouraging us or facilitating us engaging in harmful social discourse and harmful social behaviors. One of the largest areas of work that Vivian and I are engaged in is actually trying to think, how do we integrate psychosocial support, skills and emotion regulation, and increased trauma-focused training for lay providers when they're providing care, prevention work, for example, violence prevention work, whether it's in the context of gang violence in Latin America or with potential violent extremists in Central Asia. These skills that we're talking about in the context of coping with the aftermath of chronic stress and trauma can be useful skills in creating a bigger space between stimulus and response writ large, because some of the after effects of trauma involve changes to our impulse control, changes in inhibitory control. And in the same time, without inhibitory control, it's really easy to spiral and cycle into us, them thinking, into preserving my social status, watching the world around me, rejecting this immigrant group, or feeling that this political view might jeopardize. These are largely unconscious factors that create a tremendously dangerous and polarizing dynamic. So a lot of the skills are equally applicable in the violence prevention context, in the toxic polarization context, and in doing recovery work and resilience building work, for sure. And there's a second question that was relating to that around working with bullies or working with the perpetrators. So many perpetrators were once themselves victims. Vivian and I just did a workshop 2 days ago on the sort of alarmingly high rates of psychopathology and violent offenders, for example. And it's not to say that it makes you more likely, but it's to say that there is an incredibly important need and urgency to integrate principles and practices from trauma recovery, from self-care, from emotion regulation into working with folks that have been traumatized in the past or that are also at risk of continuing to harm others.
Thank you so much. An additional question we have is about, if you could share your perceptions, if you can share your ideas on the perceptions or the misperceptions of threats, which may or may not differ from what's actually happening. So the actual stressors. What has been your experience, and what kinds of exercises might you suggest in those type of misunderstandings so that people can move beyond their fight or flight or freeze responses?
Yeah, I think that with, so I guess that as always, I start with like the psychoeducation component of the understanding where the reactions are coming from. It's like the first place to catch the reactions from a place of self-compassion rather like judging ourselves harshly. But it also comes with a little bit of responsibility, right? Like the idea of psychoeducation is not just to give us a blank check of like, and I am entitled to all of these types of responses because I have suffered, and so here's what I have to offer. It's also about creating that sense of like, where are my blind spots now in the place that I'm currently am, that are perhaps again like very much based on experiences that I have had, and they're very reasonable, but they're still very much blind spots. So it's like as if to create awareness on people, that it's as if we were wearing sunglasses that are tainting everything that we see a little bit with a flare of, after trauma specifically, of like threat perception, and we're scanning and looking for threats, and in doing so we might even see them where they are not there. And so we're a comment that in another moment in our lives we might just have heard a person say something and we wouldn't have thought anything other than like, oh yes, they told me this. In a moment after trauma where we're kind of like still kind of trying to say what is safe, what isn't safe, what do I know, how predictable is the world, I may linger in that comment, and I may be like, their intention when they said that comment was entirely to like make me feel put down, or they did not like, I wouldn't take it as face value, and I will be very suspicious and wonder like, but what did they actually mean? Are they actually honest? Like these types of questionings are more present when we have had like a negative interpersonal experience that is making us reevaluate how predictable our other interpersonal experiences are. And so if we become aware that we are bringing a little bit of that bias, and we let ourselves then wonder like, okay, so I'm feeling this way, I'm having the reaction is there, it's very difficult to stop the reaction from happening. But what we do with the reaction, that's where we get a whole menu of options, right? So I can sit with the reaction and say, yes, I am feeling very irritated at this person because of this comment, because I think the comment meant this other thing. And then we can say, okay, objectively, do I know for a fact that is what the comment meant? Might there be a little bit of bias on my sense? Am I looking for evidence of the threat, or is the threat there? And what do I want to do with that information? Do I give it a little bit of a benefit of a doubt and clarify? Or do I try to not to react to the person in a way that expresses my irritability, and then creates the self-fulfilling prophecy where because I mistreated them, then they mistreat me. And then like, see, I knew it, they meant to mistreat me, but it was really our behavior that started that process, right? And so when we think of the psychoeducation, not just as the validation, but also the taking ownership and taking responsibility, then that gives us all of these avenues of saying, okay, I know that right now I'm wearing those sunglasses, so I'm gonna like allow myself to second guess myself a little bit and try and slow down a little bit my responses to get a little bit of that doubt, a little bit of more options, so that I don't escalate conflict, but actually try and clarify and de-escalate conflict.
Thank you, Vivian. And this brings us to the end of today's amazing webinar. Thank you again so much for all of you who have joined, participated, listened, and asked questions. Again, the organization is Beyond Conflict, doing all this amazing work. And I will also post a bunch of resources. Please follow us please check out Beyond Conflict's website, follow Beyond Conflict on social media. And yeah, engage with us. Check out the Barefoot, the field guide for barefoot psychology. And we welcome you to, given that this was the beginning of a conversation, we welcome you to stay involved and stay in touch. We hope you all have a wonderful evening, afternoon, wherever you are, and happy Brain Awareness Week to all of you.